Hi everyone, and welcome to the second to last video for this week. So get excited, there's only one more after this one. In this video, we'll be looking at constructions. Constructions is actually a very important concept in linguistics in general, especially the way we do it here at UNM. So let's, get right into it. A construction is basically a fixed grammatical structure or a fixed grammatical pattern that's associated with a particular function. And this can be analyzed and described relatively rigorously and relatively scientifically. So a construction is basically going to be a fixed pattern that we see fulfilling a certain function in language. And I do have some examples of that for you. Constructions can be used to do a lot of different things. Basically, almost anything in language is some kind of construction. But some of the more common constructions and some of the more common uses we have for them are to, for example, ask questions. We can use them to give commands, to negate information, to express an attitude, to emphasize something, to de-emphasize something else, to contrast things, and to express wishes. So the structures or constructions are very much related to the roles that they are filling in. So probably the most common construction, as we would say, is what's called an active, affirmative, and declarative construction. So in English, one example of this would be something like the president appointed her. This in English takes the form of a subject, verb, object construction. It could also be called an agent-patient construction, where we have an agent followed by a verb followed by a patient, if we're going with the semantic role over the grammatical role. This is generally seen as a default or unmarked construction. So basically, the president appointed her is relatively unmarked of a sentence. It's straightforward. There's nothing like we're asking a question or giving a command or anything like that. And basically, we call it the subject-verb-object construction because we can take any subject and put it in the place of the president. We can take any verb and put it in the place of appointed. We can take any object and put it in the place of her. And basically, the construction is just kind of the abstract framework for the sentence. So in English, we have an active and a passive. So those are examples of two other types of constructions. So the active is kind of what we just looked at. The president appointed her. That's a type of active construction where we have subject, verb, object, or agent and patient. But the passive is a different type of construction in English. So for the passive, to say the same basic information, we could say she was appointed by the president. So in this case, we have a subject, she, an auxiliary was, a verb, appointed, and then an oblique by the president. So we have essentially the same grammatical roles, subject, verb, and then an oblique instead of an object. But we have the patient and the agent completely switched around in terms of the semantic roles, or what the roles of these actors are actually doing. So the agent is the one who's doing the action. So the agent is the president in both cases. The patient is the one who is kind of being changed by the action. So she's being changed from unappointed to appointed. So she or her. So basically the agent and the patient switch places in the English passive construction, and the patient becomes the subject rather than the object. And then we have the agent becoming an oblique rather than the subject. So this is generally done to kind of change the emphasis of the sentence from the president doing the appointing to she being the one who is appointed. So these are kind of the differences I just mentioned. But the object of the active corresponds to the subject of the passive. The verb has an auxiliary, and it has the lexical verb, or kind of the main verb, in the passive participle form. So this is when we have gave compared to was given. We also have the subject of the active corresponding to an oblique in the passive. Or it can potentially be omitted. So we could just say she was appointed rather than she was appointed by the president. So, as I mentioned, there's kind of a functional difference. So the patient argument in the passive construction is going to become more topical and more important. So basically, she or her being appointed by the president became more important or more topical in the passive form of the sentence versus the active form. So the active construction kind of emphasizes the agent of a sentence versus the passive construction emphasizing the patient of the sentence. So yeah, here's a few things to look at, and this can be one of the kind of potential quiz questions or extra credit questions. If you go through these sentences, you can look at all of these passive expressions and decide if the agent or the patient is the kind of the main topic or the most important part of the sentence. And so basically we have the meal was prepared in advance, she was fired, he was awarded the Nobel Prize. So in all of those, kind of decide what you feel like the most important or the most topical part of the sentence is, and just kind of see if that's the agent or the patient. So the one doing the action or the one having the action performed on them. So the passive structure, in a way, so the structure we use to express the passive kind of mirrors the passive function. Or in other words, the structure is mirroring the change of topic in the sentence. So because the patient is more topical than the agent in the passive function, it is put in the more prominent position structurally of the subject. So the subject is generally in English more prominent or first in the sentence than the subject is. Or sorry, so the subject or the first word in the sentence is generally going to be the most prominent. So basically the patient gets put there if it's passive, the agent gets put there if it's active. So since the agent in a passive is more unimportant, it kind of gets demoted to an oblique, which, as we've discussed, an oblique is not really a necessary or a core argument of the sentence at all. And then a special form of the verb kind of marks that the construction is a little bit different. So we use auxiliary plus the verb to kind of mark that, yes, we are dealing with the passive here. So that is kind of a rundown of constructions. Basically, constructions are just fixed frameworks that we use to express certain ideas in a language. And we can have an active construction, a passive construction. We can even have like a command construction or a question construction or constructions for even little things. Like you could even have a marriage proposal construction where you kind of have a fixed construction for how you ask somebody to marry you or something. So that's something you see in a lot of movies or TV shows or real life where most people do it the same way. So constructions are just kind of fixed patterns that we see across a language to fulfill certain roles or certain functions in the language. So the next video will be the last one, and we'll be looking at kind of the syntax of a sentence as a whole.